everyone, to What the Force, and welcome to a special, fun, I would say very exciting for me personally, because I love this subject, interview with Marc Sumerak. Welcome, Marc.
Thank you so much for having me back. It's great to be here.
Yeah, it's been an entire year since Droidography came out, and I had you on the show for that, which was so much fun because droids in the Force are like my jam. So this is so much fun to have you back, especially to talk about the secrets of the Jedi. And we're also going to talk about the cool cookbook that's also coming out in November too.
Great.
Maybe let's dig into that. Like, tell me a little bit about what that project all is. And
yeah, sure. The cookbook, it is the Star Wars Galaxy's Edge official Black Spire Outpost cookbook. So it is the official cookbook that will be sold at the Disney parks in Galaxy's Edge, the new land that is both at Disneyland and the Walt Disney World Resort. And it is built on recipes from the parks that are inspired by the parks and that are inspired by the Star Wars saga as a whole. So there's obviously, it's a 200-page book. So there aren't 200 pages worth of recipes from the parks. So we also delved deep into some of our favorite, and fan favorite recipes from throughout the saga, things that people have always wanted to know how to cook or have always, wondered about. And we got them onto the page so that people could enjoy them. And the neat thing about this particular book is there have been Star Wars cookbooks before. Like BB-8 and Wookiee's Cookies and those types of things. But this is the first in-world Star Wars cookbook. So it is actually written as if it is a collection of actual recipes from the galaxy far, far away.
So the true question is there the Bantha rump roast?
You know what? There is not a Bantha rump roast, but there's a really nice shock roast.
Okay.
There is, it's a braised shock roast. It's lovely. There's a lot of tip-yip recipes from Endor. There's all kinds of fun stuff.
Tip-yip.
There's even a root leaf stew for Yoda.
Oh, good.
Sure to cover as many bases as we could and to have as much fun as we could. If there were little Star Wars food references that we found throughout the history of the saga in canon that we liked, we tried to draw them out and find a way to cook them at home.
So did you get to cook any of the recipes like in the lead up for this? Because I know that you were like almost speaking from the voice of the cook, right? Like that's the part that you contributed to the project. But
exactly. The book is written in the voice of Strono Tugs, who is the chef at Docking Bay 7 at Galaxy's Edge, for those who have been there. And for those who haven't been there, he appears briefly in Maz's castle on Takodana. He's very, very briefly in The Force Awakens. And the story behind him is after the castle falls, he then decides to start his own intergalactic food truck, cruising the Outer Rim, collecting recipes and cooking at different outposts. And he happens to be stationed at Black Spire the week that you come to visit Batuu. And so he is serving at the Docking Bay right now, his little taste of Takodana from his food truck, Tug's Grub. And so it's written from Cookie's perspective, which was a lot of fun. And the chef who developed all the recipes alongside Walt Disney's food and beverage team was Chelsea Munro Castle. And she's well known for doing a lot of really cool genre cookbooks. She did an Overwatch cookbook and I believe she did a World of Warcraft cookbook that was really popular. She's done a Firefly cookbook. So she's done all of these really cool in-world cookbook things, and the two of us teamed up to bring this one to life.
That's so fun. And it's got to be fun too for kids who are like, oh, I'm getting into Star Wars and I kind of want to do something with my family. And you can be like, oh, let's bring this home with us. That's fun.
Right. Yeah, and there's lots of great stuff that's, it's very family friendly, but there's also plenty of stuff for the adult fans too, in that we, Oga's Cantina at the parks has plenty of libations for everyone, and we have quite a few of those in the book.
Oh, wow. So there's actually like a bar mixology
there's
section
a drink
to it.
section and everything.
That's awesome.
So if you want to have a Rhodian splice at home, you can.
So if you want to have like a Star Wars themed party, adult party, you can actually do that. That's so much fun.
Yes, you can dine in a galaxy far, far away.
That's great. So that's kind of your specialty, is like speaking with the voices of characters. And you do that in this new book that's coming out this week, The Secrets of the Jedi. And it's actually written from the perspective of Luke Skywalker.
Yeah. And that was quite a challenge because I grew up with Luke. I will always have naive young farm boy Luke in my brain as the Luke that I first encountered and the Luke that I grew up with. And then him becoming a Jedi throughout the course of the original trilogy. I followed his journey, but this book is written from the perspective of Luke in the modern trilogy, in the current trilogy, where he has gone through a whole lot more, and he has a very different perspective on life than the Luke that I grew up with. So it was very interesting to try to recalibrate my inner voice for Luke, the one that I've always heard in my head, into the Luke from The Last Jedi, and to find how those two Lukes reconcile. So it was really an adventure for me as I was writing it, to kind of get to take old Luke and new Luke and put them together and find why it all coexists so well. And it really taught me a lot about the more recent movies in the process, things that I hadn't realized when I went back to that 6th or 7th rewatching as I was writing the book, and went, wow, those things really connect together in ways that I didn't get on the first or second watch.
So what are some of the lessons that you took away from writing from Luke's perspective?
I think more than anything, how wrong there's so many people out there who are saying Luke would never do that. I think I took away how wrong that is. I think every journey is different, and there are so many choices that we make in life that can lead us down different paths, and none of them are right or wrong. None of them are predestined. And I think that's what's so interesting about this Luke, about The Last Jedi's Luke, is that maybe it's not the Luke that we pictured when we were younger. Maybe it's not the ending that we wrote for him in our heads, but it doesn't make it any less valid. And it doesn't make his journey any less real. And I think that was something that along the way was really a nice discovery, because I loved The Last Jedi from the moment I watched it. I thought it was a great movie. I was never a naysayer for that movie. But when you read the constant onslaught of commentary online talking about Luke would never act like that, well, when you really go back and look, it makes perfect sense why he did. And I think, upon really delving into him as a character in his modern incarnation versus his younger incarnation, it's a very natural path. And I think that was one of the things that I really enjoyed about this process, was really getting into his head and finding out why he made those choices and why it affected him the way it did. Why he decided to remove himself, why he lost hope for a while, and why that hope was eventually able to come back through Rey and through his time on Ahch-To and his personal journey. Yeah,
and then, like, to say that his story ended at the Return of the Jedi is to say that human stories end after high school in some ways. Everybody faces new challenges and new journeys, and in some ways, like, if you were to map him like to the hero's journey from a Joseph Campbell perspective, this is another one of those journeys that he's on.
Absolutely. Yeah. And he's, and in many ways, he's completed a segment of it, but there's still more to go. And I'm excited, along with the rest of fandom, to find out what this last chapter brings.
For Luke, especially. Yeah. I think it will give us a lot of insight into what the saga means from his perspective as the almost, if you think about a 9-movie arc, the moment that he and his father confront each other in Bespin, in Cloud City, and, I am your father, that is the climax of the whole thing. So he is actually one of the most important characters, the handoff between, the saga before and the saga now, and what that knowledge and what that, like, what is he going to bring to help these characters move on through all of this family drama that has happened this whole time.
Yeah. It is really astounding. And there's a certain sadness to seeing the saga come to an end, for all of us, I think, the idea that it's finally going to be complete and what comes after it. But I really am just as excited as everyone, I think, to see how it all resolves and to see how those threads come together, because it is the way that everything is weaving together presents itself to such an astounding ending. And I have no concept really of how it's going to come together. I don't think anybody really does until we've watched it. That's the thing. We can all write our own versions in our head, and we all have ideas and hopes and dreams of how things might resolve. But I think if this trilogy has taught us anything, it's we can throw those out the window and follow the themes and follow the paths that have been laid out to exciting new places along with the filmmakers.
Yeah, and I think that this trilogy so far at least has really reinforced so many of the core tenets of Star Wars, and especially like The Last Jedi itself recommitted the knowledge of what the Force is.
Yes.
So well, and like that plays very well into this book being set kind of between when Rey leaves and Luke decides to help.
Yeah, he's a very fast writer. Luke.
I mean, you know, I covered this actually in a recent episode, and I know that you spoke with Jason Fry about how time kind of works differently on Acto. I think you tweeted that, that, you know, Acto and Dagobah and these kind of places that are very powerful with the Force, like time doesn't really matter. It kind of works the way that you need it to work because it wants you to get stuff done. And obviously the Force wanted Luke to write this book that probably took him a little while.
I wish it worked that way in my office sometimes. That for the sake of my deadlines, that the Force slowed down time just a little bit for me. But yeah, you know, I think it really is. You know, there's that idea of, you know, well, when could he have written this? And in my thought, you know, once you read the book, you'll see it kind of chronicles the journey from when Rey arrives on the island to when Luke finally makes his decision that there's still hope. And I tend to believe that this was kind of scribed during that process. And you'll see from page to page mild changes in his perspective, and that was very deliberate.
Yeah, no, he definitely goes through a journey, and I would say that he's certainly hopeful by the end on what Rey will be able to do for the galaxy and how he can help in that moment. And he certainly does seem to align his hopes with Rey by the end.
Yes.
Whereas he's very, I don't know, sad, I guess, in the beginning.
Yes. And I think by the end, he also is not 100% convinced on poor sweet Ben yet.
Yeah.
But I think he's maybe starting to come around to the realization that if there's hope for the Force, and if there's hope for me, and there's hope for Rey, there might still be a chance. And so, you know, there is this journey that he's taking, and we know when, you know, he makes his final efforts exactly what happens, because we saw it in the movie.
Yeah.
But
and he is hopeful for him, I think.
Yeah, we will see what comes next, and that is going to be interesting. You know, it's going to be interesting to see how the Force and how the future of the Force and the Jedi affect many, many different characters in the saga, and all through the lens of what Luke did before them.
So I guess my next question is, because it's covered in this. I mean, we're talking about an entire order of people that have devoted themselves solely to this concept of the Force. Yes. But what is the Force, Mark?
Well, the Force is an energy that flows through us all. You know, it is a living entity that kind of permeates all things, connects all things, and binds us all together. It's not, you know, as Luke said, it's not a power. It doesn't belong to anybody. It's there around us, between us, connecting us, and living in us. And we can tap into it for good or for bad. You know, it is essentially something that can be manipulated in ways to great success or to great failure for those who choose to touch it, and for those around them.
I like to think of it as, in some ways, the energy of others, like especially. And George Lucas really came, you know, with that idea, especially from the movie 2187. And how he kind of, it's the force of others. It's how you can kind of feel that force of others. And this ties very much to the mythological idea of the source and the energy that exists, again, within all things.
Yeah.
And that, like, is the idea that what we put out into the world actually does have power and does affect others. And so, you know, from a Jedi perspective, if you're not facing and, I don't know, having having that mindful conversation about, okay, if everything that I do actually affects others, unless I'm trying to do good, I'm actually causing harm.
Right. Right. And they found that out the hard way.
Yeah. Yeah. And like getting caught with the war, right? Like that's how it all happened. And I mean, what do all of these teachers, like he literally had the opportunity to learn from so many different people who told him about the past. Like that's one of the things that I really love about this. Like it like Ahsoka Tano is mentioned as a character and that he talks about and that he understands like kind of her place in his history, because in some ways, as Luke Skywalker, he is the inheritor of all of this Jedi history.
Right. So she's practically in his family tree, you know.
Like she's like an adopted aunt. Like like so what was it like to try to be like, okay, so Luke knows about these people now?
Right. Yeah. And I mean, that was a challenge because you never want to go in and say, you know, he learned this specific thing from this person and this specific thing from that person, because that's not there, you know, in the movies per se, and it hasn't been revealed in greater canon as to which teachings he took from whom. But for me, it was more about inspiration from their stories. You know, he's got this chronicle of the Jedi in this tree on Ahch-To, and things that he collected in his journey between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens. You know, he went off into the galaxy, he collected Jedi artifacts, he tried to hunt down the things to rebuild the Order, and he learned those stories along the way. So it was more to him, I think, about the teachings and the examples that they set so that he could pass those along to his new students, looking back at these great masters and finding out where they succeeded and where they failed, and how that could be applied to the next generation, and how it could also be brought into his own teachings in his own life. But yeah, it was wonderful for me to be able to, you know, look at the fact and think that at some point in his journey, he discovered the rich stories of all of these Jedis of the past. And, you know, one we included that isn't, you know, terribly well known. We included Hulik, who is a Rhodian Jedi. He was a Jedi Knight who died, and he was in one of the Luke Skywalker stories from a novelization where Luke found his tomb and learned all about his past from his niece, from Hulik's niece, about how he had fought in the Clone Wars, and his ship had flown him back to his home planet after he had died. And Luke found his lightsaber, and it was before Luke had built his own lightsaber after Empire Strikes Back. And he tried to take this former Jedi's lightsaber and rebuild it for himself, but failed. And he learned something about the process through that. And it was neat to get to put the stories of all of these different knights and masters into this book to show how they shaped Luke's experience.
And not only that, you also talk about the Darksiders too, and like almost like the lessons that needed to be learned from each of their falls and their what they experienced when they were alive and what happened with them. So not only about Sith Lords, but Inquisitors and kind of things that have certainly been added since, you know, Disney took over the canon and solidified everything. But
it was nice to be able to expand a little bit on the dark side there. I didn't want it all to be just the Force, the light side of the Force. I wanted to be able to show Luke's perspective on the dark side as well, because that's so important to where he stands on the Force. It's so important to what he's experienced with the Force, and it's so important to what his family has experienced in the Force, because there is a proclivity towards the dark side that runs in his bloodline. And so it really is necessary for him to have a deep understanding of it, and not just from Vader and Kylo Ren, but also, you know, down to things like the Inquisitors, who are the Jedi hunters that have been featured in many of the peripheral, the cartoons and the video games and stuff, to be able to explore what all of those aspects of the dark side mean, and who these people were and why they would want the Jedi extinguished.
It certainly seems like he was actually a really good student in the end, because he learned so much. I loved
better than he gave himself credit for, I think.
I know that you probably didn't get to choose this, but I love that you used the Sith or Darksider symbol that is used from Mortis. I thought like
Yes.
behind the scenes, that was really a really nice little Easter egg. So you're like, oh, where is this from? Oh, that's from Mortis. That's a lot of information.
Well, I love all that Mortis Gods stuff. I think it's great, and I wish there had been more space in this particular project to expand upon it and to include more about it. I find all of that background fascinating, from Clone Wars and Rebels, and wow, there's a lot of neat stuff there that I think would have taken dozens more pages to fit into this particular project, but that I enjoy personally very, very much, learning about and reading about.
Did you get an opportunity to kind of ask questions about that aspect of it, or any of the kind of bigger things?
One of the great things about this process was, there was a lot of great discussion back and forth with the entire team on how to approach it and what to include. So, it was really, there was a great give and take and ebb and flow of ideas between everybody involved. There's so much wealth. You got to remember, this is a 32-page book. And there's such a wealth of Jedi knowledge out there that boiling it down to the core was no easy task. It was really about what is essential for Luke's perspective in this particular retelling of the journey for this book. But man, there is so much stuff that we could get into a volume 2 of Secrets of the Jedi, were we ever to have one. Who knows? Maybe Ray will write one someday.
I sort of imagine, like, when you go and have to speak with Lucasfilm about the Force, they almost have to put you through like Force boot camp to like make sure you get it. Like, right. what are the key concepts that you need to wrap your head around? Because the Force itself is very cerebral.
It is.
And to understand that you are part of it, but it is also this giant thing that you are also part of is a massive concept to wrap your head around.
Yeah. Well, and there are so many perspectives on the Force from fans and from people who have written Star Wars material over the years that it doesn't necessarily make any perspective wrong. There's just so many different viewpoints on what the Force is and what it can be. And it's always interesting to look back and see those different perspectives and how they fit together and how they build the greater image of what the Force is.
Yeah, I used this description once to talk about kind of how Star Wars comes together with more and more iterations and perspectives. It helps us get to almost like the platonic ideal of Star Wars and the concepts behind it. And in some ways, like, that's what's going on with the Force, because it's pulling on a very fundamental human Jungian type concept of us all being part of like a collective unconscious in some ways, and like having the conversations about what is happening from a mythic perspective, and archetypes end up showing up when you end up talking about conversations with the larger Force through things like Mortis or World Between Worlds and things like that. But what's fascinating is when we have more people join in the conversation and they're talking about this idea, this very cerebral idea, you end up getting closer to the truth, I think, which is awesome.
I agree. Yeah, it is interesting to see, when you look back at where it all started and how it's developed over the years and how it's built. I think you're absolutely right. I think the more perspectives you get and the more voices that join the chorus, I think the clearer the Force is. I think that's a beautiful way of looking at it.
So what are the things that you were particularly drawn to personally with this project?
For me, it was really just getting down to the core of what the Force meant to Luke in his current day, and what it meant to Luke throughout his journey. And then also, since this is a book that is designed with younger readers in mind, this is much like droidography. This is a book that was designed with younger readers in mind. Now it's meant to appeal to anyone of the fandom, but it is supposed to be there so that younger readers can get a good understanding of what these concepts are from a clear perspective. It was really trying to boil these concepts down to their core in an easily digestible way without losing the glory of necessarily what they are. So for me, that was a really fun challenge. Was to take such big ideas and present them in a way that they could be kind of universally understood by people who are coming in through to the saga from years of experience or who are watching their very first Star Wars movie ever. And I wanted to try to approach that. And that's no easy task. Hopefully I've managed to pull that off on a small level. But I want anyone to be able to pick up this book and understand the concepts that are explained within without necessarily, I mean, there are kids like my daughter who's 5, who's watched one movie and really enjoyed it. And I want to be able to read this with her and have her have a basic understanding of what these concepts are, but I still want it to be enjoyable for someone who's been a fan for 40 years.
Yeah, I think there's a universality about what has been done in this book that is really amazing. And it really does distill it down to, okay, especially what is Luke's perspective on everything? And it almost gives you like a really nice timestamp. Like, okay, before this saga ends, because we know it's the end of the saga, right. This is what the Force is all about, what the Jedi were all about, and what kind of it all is in this moment in time. And I think that that's really wonderful, especially like you can almost like feel his concern through the whole thing. It's really interesting. So what was the thing that I guess like that's in the book that you were surprised to learn about? You know,
for me, I think some of the surprise for me came from when I was delving into the Force powers a little bit deeper. Because there's two spreads in the book devoted specifically to Force powers. And at first I had them all kind of lumped together as, these are Force abilities. And the more we looked at them, the more we kind of shifted them to be a light Force abilities and a dark Force abilities page, because of the way they've been used throughout the saga. And because of the types of uses that have happened with these particular Force abilities. And I think, some of them I almost kind of argued at first. And I said, no, that's more of a universal Force ability, like either side. And then when I went back and kind of re-examined when they were used and how they were used, I went, ooh, that is a lot darker than I think I realized. Or no, there's more positives to that than negatives. And the way they shifted out kind of at the end surprised me a little bit, I think. Because there were certain aspects. I mean, obviously Force lightning most of the time used in the dark side.
I don't know that we've seen an instance of a positive use of Force lightning. Exactly.
But then there's things like the Force bond. That was one that I was looking at, and I was thinking of, of more of a neutral version of that. But then, for various reasons, when examining how Luke would view it, on top of how it's been used throughout the core saga, it kind of shifted more towards the dark end, especially because of the idea of how it can be manipulated and perverted.
Right.
Especially from the outside. There's much speculation of Snoke having a great effect on poor young Kylo. And that also comes from that area of the Force bond. And so it really was interesting to me to get to look at those things and say, where do these all fall in to a Jedi's perspective on how to and how not to use the Force?
And it's interesting too, because like the choke we've seen Luke use, right? But then in his perspective, he's probably like, I probably shouldn't have used that.
Yeah, I think even in the book, he's kind of like, that was not the best thing to do.
Oh gosh, yeah.
The Gamorrean guard at that one point, and he knows better.
And like mind probe, especially getting into people's heads, of course, invasion of privacy and things like that, as well as how almost like Force control. And I noticed that there really wasn't like Ezra's power to control animals in there, which was really interesting.
Yeah.
And how he kind of uses it when he turns to the dark a little bit. I feel like it's very related to the mind probe.
I agree.
because he uses it to kind of control a human.
Yep.
Which is very scary.
And that one wasn't necessarily mentioned specifically in here, but I definitely had that one in mind. I think I love Rebels to death. I think it's a fantastic show, and there's such a depth of material in Rebels. And I think I make some little nods also. You'll find throughout the book. I think you'll find a well-known lightsaber in there that might harken back to Ezra, and some other things in there. That there's some mentions of Depa Billaba and Caleb Doom that will tie into anyone who loves the Rebels lore. So yeah, I'm with you on that. I definitely think there's some attachment in there.
Luke never really knew about Ezra. So
right.
I think that's fascinating, because
I think there are probably ways between that nebulous period of between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens, where there's always the possibility that some of this information fell into his hands in one way or another. And that's how bits and pieces made it into this book. I like to have hope that those stories lasted on.
Yeah, but he wasn't necessarily in direct contact with them, which is okay too. It means his story is yet to be told for us as the audience, and that's okay.
And I certainly don't want to be the one who takes away the joy of telling it from anyone.
Dave Filoni would not let you.
Right.
He definitely would not.
I would never allow that. I would never let that happen. Not my story to tell.
How did this all start, and what is the process of going about creating a book like this?
Well, really, more than anything, it started after Droidography. Because Droidography had been a real pleasant success. We enjoyed working on it. Everybody was happy with the final product. Fans seemed happy with it, and so we knew we wanted to do another book of that style. And that the Jedi were a great topic to tackle next. And with Droidography, we had a very specific point of view for that book, which was Roger from the Freemaker Adventures. He was the narrator of the book. And so we wanted to make sure that we did the same. But we knew that the Jedi were not nearly as lighthearted a topic as droids, and that we couldn't have a narrator nearly as jovial as Roger at the helm. So as we looked through, we as with any book like this, you're really looking for your voice more than anything when you get started. You're looking for how you're going to tell this story and from what perspective you're going to tell this story. And so for us, it was a matter of finding the right narrator. And we went through a bunch of ideas. I looked at the possibility of telling it from Ben's journals, from Obi-Wan's journals, rather.
Yeah. Yep.
And because we know that those are out there, and we know that in the comic book series, the Marvel comic book series, that there have been excerpts from those that have been single issue stories throughout the run, Jason Aaron's run of the comics, that have looked back at little micro adventures of Obi-Wan, or have told stories of former Jedi through his perspective. So that was a possibility. There were a bunch of things that we threw out on the table, but the one we all kept coming back to was finding a way to tell it from Luke's perspective. And so as we were working on this, we had cemented the notion of telling it from the modern trilogy Luke Skywalker on Ahch-To's perspective. And that's when things started to really click into place. So for me, it was really just immersing myself in that particular movie and in the surrounding lore, and making sure that I had a very good footing on what his voice was and what his perspective was. Because as I said earlier, it's very different from the Luke of the original trilogy. And so I had to, it took me a while. The first draft I wrote of the book was probably more young Luke than current Luke. And that's just because I had to shake out those cobwebs. I had to get rid of the Luke that had lived in my head for so long and update the voice to the new one. And so I turned in that first draft and I went, that's not going to do it. That's not the right tone for him. That would work for young Luke, but it's not going to work for Luke now. And so rewatching the movie over and over and over, one of the steps that I actually took was, and this works really well for me when I'm finding a character's voice, and I do this on other projects as well, but I did one pass on the movie where I typed all of the dialogue for the movie as Luke was saying it.
Oh, interesting.
And that to me kind of has a tactile transfer effect. And I do that a lot when I'm trying to get the voice of a character. I wrote some Firefly books a few years back. And while I was watching that, I was writing multiple characters from the series at once. And so I would take notes on the series while writing out dialogue for one certain character, and then go back and write for another character before I had to write their sections of the book. And it just gets me into the swing of writing in their voice. And it's not a matter of I want to write that exact same dialogue in my book, but my fingers start to understand the cadence of their voice and the rhythm of their words as I'm typing, and it just kind of clicks in my head. I know it's a weird process, but it's what does it for me. And so I did that on one of the passes, and then I just kind of let it play in the background as I was working, and that hearing that voice and being able to live with that Luke for a while really clicked me into where I needed to be. And then it was a matter of figuring out, going back to The Force Awakens and figuring out the journeys of the other characters up to that point and how they all connected and interwove, so that when Luke had perspectives on them, that they reflected their journey accurately as well, or didn't reflect their journey accurately if needed.
Yeah.
Remember, yes, Luke Skywalker is one of our favorite characters in the world, but that doesn't necessarily mean he's always a reliable narrator. Everybody has a perspective. Everybody has a voice. And everybody has an opinion. And Luke has opinions too. When he's human. None of us are perfect heroes. And so what he's gone through is going to flavor how he views things and how he views people in a way that isn't necessarily going to be what we take away from watching it on the screen and seeing all of the scenes that he didn't.
Oh my God, you just said the words that I love the most, which is something Star Wars does so well, which is unreliable narrators, and how that tends to mess with, I don't know, maybe the modern day film viewing audience, and how they almost take everything they see as truth. Whereas if you go back and you go and look at like film noir, or, even Westerns, or Kurosawa, or the Rashomon movies that are referenced from a genre perspective in The Last Jedi, unreliable narrator is like a tool by which we find the truth of the story through the story.
Yep.
Oh, 100%. You just gave me shivers. I love it.
There's so much of that in The Last Jedi. I mean, there's so much of it. The entire origin of Kylo Ren is based on unreliable narration. No one really knows the truth of what happened there. They both think they do, but their perspectives are so based on how they viewed that moment that it's hard for us to believe any of the three versions that we saw. You know what I mean?
Exactly.
And so, I think, and I think that's okay. I think we can put those pieces together and figure out for ourselves why things ended up that way. And maybe those moments in between don't matter. Maybe the truth of those moments in between aren't what's important. It's how those moments affected the outcome.
Yeah, exactly.
And so to Luke, they're one thing, to young Ben, they're another. And how do they all lead to where we are now?
And it's not even the first time that we've seen this in the saga. Near the end of the Clone Wars, in, Revenge of the Sith, the Jedi's perspective on themselves and on the galaxy is tainted, and it comes from a very particular angle. And so they're not necessarily the best person to rely on to say, oh yeah, everything is hunky-dory. Well, no, it's actually not. Right. And, especially we're getting more and more of these perspectives. And that's where I love the iteration of Star Wars. And we get all of these different angles to try to understand the truth of what is being said.
Yeah. I mean, there's one thing serving the light, and there's another thing to be blinded by it. And I mean, that's one of the reasons Luke stepped away. He looked back at these old Jedis, and he saw that sometimes the light can obscure your vision. And sometimes you need to step away. Sometimes you need to cut yourself off. And perhaps his reaction was too extreme for many of us, but I can understand why.
Well, and especially if you don't know what to do because you're too overcome by the experiences and what has happened with especially Ben, and we know this bad thing happened. We know the bad thing happened, and it caused him to hide, basically. So yeah, we know it was serious. And again, like you said, blinded by the light, but it's also in some ways blinded by the doctrine. Like, they don't remember why they're doing the things that they're doing. They're just doing them for the sake of doing them.
You're right. Yep. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Losing sight of what the original core of who they were was meant to be.
And like why it was important. Upholding the light for the Jedi was part of the core doctrine, but they ended up kind of losing that path in trying to maintain the ritual for ritual's sake rather than action for good sake.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Yeah. It's a complex topic, and to like talk through it, in some ways the conversation is almost happening in the book itself a little bit, because he's trying to struggle with his own feelings on what the Jedi were, and that he feels like the concept and the idea is still required.
Really, I wanted him to be able to try to come to terms over the course of the book. That was the goal from page 1 to the final page, was, can he come to terms? Can he reconcile? Can he get from where he was at the beginning of the movie to the end of the movie in the course of this book? And so that was the journey that I wanted to take. And hopefully it's one that he was able to do so convincingly in these pages, because that was the intent, was am I able to get to the point where I can believe again, even just enough that I can make a difference.
So, who did you get to work with on this? Obviously, like the artist who.
Yeah, it was the artist was absolutely amazing. Yeah, it was just fantastic. His name was Sergio Gomez Silvan. And I'd never worked with him before. I only got to see his work when we first started the project.
Oh, wow.
But as pages started to trickle in, all of a sudden my words mattered a whole lot less to me because of all these pretty pictures. And I was already done writing it. So that's not to say like I gave up trying to make good words. What I'm saying is, like, I was so concerned, like, is this book going to live up to the expectations? And then I saw this art and I went, oh man,
it's gorgeous.
I think so now, because it's just so pretty. And one of the nice things about it is it's got kind of this spot color kind of feel, where it's almost like sepia tone kind of illustrations that veer towards like blue and red, depending on what the side of the Force being focused on is. And occasionally it'll just be a hint of a lightsaber color or a hint of a Force power. And it's really, really cool. I mean, the warmth and tone in this book is just astounding thanks to his art. And
it looks almost like parchment too, like the pages. Yeah.
We wanted to feel kind of handwritten. There's not a lot of textural writing in the Star Wars saga. There's not a lot of paper. Everything's data on pads and on screens, and there's not a lot of paper writing. And so seeing actual books like the ones in Luke's library in the tree on Octo is a rarity in the Star Wars universe. So we wanted to make it feel like it had a little bit of weight and texture and depth to it, because it would be one of the few actual book type elements in that world. And so that was, we wanted to feel more like drawings and handwriting necessarily than like something you'd be reading off of a data pad. The droidology we designed a little bit more like a high-tech data pad kind of feel. And this
like almost like a manual. It had that feel like droidography. Yeah. And I love that this book as well, like droidography, has all these pop-ups and pullouts and additional information. Like, like when you pull out the holocron page, it actually pops up to look like a holocron.
I liked that. There's a little holocron in the book. That made me happy. There's some pop-up flaps. There's some transparencies. There's some neat little pullouts. There's some hidden, for those who get the book, there's some little hidden notes and stuff that are tucked inside a little pocket.
In Arabish.
yeah, and we have a little translator for those who cannot read it fluently.
Can you?
You know what? Oddly enough, I have taught myself to read a couple of fake languages in the last year or so. I can't read it fast. but like I've memorized the symbols so that it's a little bit easier for me.
Do you have the punctuation down too?
In the X-Men comics right now, in the current run of X-Men comics, they're living on an island called Krakoa, and they have their own language that has its own letters. And I memorized that so that I don't have to keep referencing it every time I read an X-Men comic. So I'm weird like that when it comes to symbology as letters. So I am not going to be able to read it to you like fluently, but I can sit there and decipher it in a couple of minutes if I need to.
That's awesome. I've been working on it just because I hope to go to Galaxy's Edge in the next couple of months, and I just want to this will be good exercise for me going through it and actually trying to like read it without the little key. Right. Will be good exercise for me. And I also love that you include like the Jedi Code in there. There's so many different there's little moments throughout the book where I'm like, oh, you're talking about that, like midichlorians and the perspective that Luke had on midichlorians, which is so neat. There's just so many wonderful moments that like I'm absolutely in love with this book.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I mean, it was fun for me to go back and explore like lightsabers, because lightsabers, we know about lightsabers. We've seen everything we need to know about lightsabers, but I wanted Luke's perspective on lightsabers. I mean, this is a guy who got his father's lightsaber and then had to build his own lightsaber when he lost it, and it went through this journey and then got one back and threw it away. I wanted his perspective on what a lightsaber is, why it's important, how it's constructed, what aligns it with the Force, and how to use it well. Because I thought he would have a unique viewpoint on all of that.
And also like kyber crystals, which had a very specific meaning, especially in the Clone Wars, but like in the Clone Wars cartoon from a Yoda perspective, but like he has almost a different view than how Yoda viewed them, which is just so, it's like, there's just so much joy I have in seeing kind of the angle that Luke understands the universe.
Awesome. That was
yeah. No, I definitely got out of it, and I've started to read it with my son, who is 8, and I'm trying to get him to read at least half of it because he struggles with some of the words. But I think that the bright pictures, the subject matter itself, like who doesn't want to be a Jedi Knight, is really appealing, especially to kids, but also to me as a connoisseur of Force activities.
Well, this is the perfect manual for any youngling who wants to move on to Padawan. This will give them anything that they need to know. And so hopefully it provides the start of their journey, a solid foundation.
So what other projects are you working on right now, Mark? And, what do you want to tell people that they should be paying attention to other than this book, which you should totally pick up, which is out this week?
Well, we've also got that Star Wars Galaxy's Edge cookbook, which also comes out in November and should be available both in bookstores and at the Disney parks. And then I've got some new content coming up. I'm the writer for Marvel Ultimate Alliance 3, The Black Order, which is available on the Nintendo Switch. And we're currently working on downloadable content for that game. We just had our Marvel Knights characters released, and we've got X-Men and Fantastic Four packs coming over the course of the year, which is really exciting.
There was a new world that just loaded like a couple of weeks ago, I think.
Yeah. Stuff. So it's pretty exciting to keep that game rolling along, and people seem to be enjoying it. And then beyond that, I've got some new books on the slate for next year that I'm just starting out. And none of them are things that can be announced yet, but I'm really, really excited about what comes next because there's going to be some fun new things. And I've got a 7-month-old at home, so every day is a new project and adventure.
A new project and an adventure, and a new youngling to train in the ways of the Force.
Absolutely.
Well, Mark, where can people find you if they're interested in checking out this or any of the other projects that you've got underway?
You can find information about all of my work at my website, which is www.sumerak.com, SUMERAK.com. And I'm also on Facebook and Twitter and all of those fun social media things, so people can look me up directly from links on my website.
Awesome. And it's Sumerak on Twitter.
Yes,
I
that's
believe.
my Twitter. Yep.
Yep. And I'll link to those in the liner notes so it's easier to find, as well as I'll link to the book, which you can find as soon as it's available through probably anywhere books are sold.
Exactly.
Thank you, Mark.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to What the Force. I'm Marie-Claire Gould, your host. Our music is the What the Force theme, orchestral music by Christy Carew for What the Force. We have a Patreon at patreon.com/whattheforce. We'd like to thank all our patrons, especially those who love What the Force: Night Huntress in Wild Space, Susan, Jessica, Cassandra Corvid, Brad, Black Eyed Lily, and Anna Perez. Make sure you like and subscribe on YouTube or leave a 5-star review on iTunes or other pod apps. It helps people find the show. You can connect with us on Twitter at WT Force Show, at What the Force Podcast on Facebook, or on our website at whattheforce.ca. Feel free to reach out to us and start a conversation. Cheers.